Though there are accounts of European colonies dating back to the 2nd century, along with French settlers arriving in the 16th century, it wasn't until around 1850 to 1840 that Canada as a colony saw a boom in growth, development, and immigration from England. With Queen Victoria's reign commencing in 1837, we will be discussing the fashion history timeline with the decade of the 1830s and diving into what life for European settlers in Canada looked like. Canadian fashion at this time took influence from several sources. As more Europeans were settling and expanding their families on Canadian soil, a new identity of people was being created. In the 1830s, fashion largely reflected what continued back in the settlers' homelands of France and England. However, through the years, Canadians began to adapt certain fashions for practicality. Not only were the French and English influencing the average settler's clothes, but the Indigenous peoples had a heavy influence on their fashion as well. Those silhouettes reflected what was being worn in Europe. Canadian settlers had quickly adapted to Canada's harsh weather and rough terrain. Aristocracy in Europe was built upon fashion as a representation of your social standing, but for those immigrating and choosing to build a life in Canada's backwoods, you quickly had to adapt to a simpler life of survival. The upper class in England were no stranger to fancy silks and having their maid staff do the most mundane tasks for them. In the 1830s, women's fashion is identifiable by two separate silhouettes throughout the decade, starting with the years prior to Queen Victoria's ascension to the throne, 1830 to 1835. During this time, a short waist was popular, having it cinched just above the natural waistline. This hourglass figure was popular for both men's and women's fashion of the Romantic period. Gigot or leg-in-a-mutton sleeves were a defining feature of this early decade silhouette. The sleeves came in various styles and sizes. Another notable feature of the 1830s dress is the hem length. Skirts at this time fell just above the ankle, an unusual signifier in an era where the hem more often than not reached the ground. Skirts were bell-shaped, and prior to the introduction of the cage crinoline in 1856, heavily starched corded petticoats were used to support the shape of the skirt silhouette of this time. Prior to this point in history, corsets were not yet a thing, and cinching the waist even more so. Prior to the corset, there were short stays, and before that, stays, or also known as a pair of bodies. Both of these garments did not function the same way a Victorian corset did. There was only one form of fastening the garment, and it did not specifically cinch the waistline or shape the body. Rather, they provided structural support and protection. But in the 1830s, with the help of the Industrial Revolution, the metal eyelet had come into play, and thus the creation of a corset that is more flexible and has the ability to shape a person. During this time, Romanticism was key. For a few decades, there was this uprise of fantasizing about the past. As defined by the Britannica Encyclopedia, here are some key characteristics of Romanticism: a deepened appreciation of the beauties of nature, a general exaltation of emotion over reason, and of the senses over intellect. The artist as a supremely individual creator, whose creative spirit is more important than strict adherence to formal rules and traditional procedures. An emphasis upon imagination as a gateway to transcendent experience and spiritual truth. An obsessive interest in folk culture and the medieval era. And a predilection for the exotic, the remote, the mysterious, the weird, the occult, the monstrous, the diseased, and even the satanic. Catherine Partrail, a Canadian pioneer and author, gives insight to what life was like in the early days of the settlement and how contrasting fashion was for those starting a new life in Canada compared to England's high fashion society. For starters, she writes, "It is one of the blessings of this new country that a young person's respectability does by no means depend upon these points of style and dress. How much more sensible I thought these young people than if they had made themselves slaves to tyrant fashion. Nevertheless, in some of the large towns, the young people do dress extravagantly and even exceeded those of Britain in their devotion to fine and costly apparel. The folly of this is apparent to every sensible person." Partrail also reveals, at least from her very Eurocentric point of view, what it was like to go from upper-class England to surviving the brutal climate and terrain of Canada. It is interesting to see that while we commonly associate the Victorian era with fashion determining your social standing, this was not the case in Canada amongst the pioneers. This is also interesting, for in the later years of the decade, after Queen Victoria's coronation, fashion quickly went from exuberant to modest. Despite Victoria's young age of 18, she is noted to have preferred a simpler style and was cautious regarding new fashions, something I'm sure Miss Catherine Partrail would approve of. While Partrail gives us some insight into what the upper class was wearing in the more developed areas of the country, she also lets us know much more about the life of an immigrant woman in the 1830s. Fashion imitated the styles they knew in England, however, the average unskilled upper class English woman was not prepared for the harsh reality of what it took to survive as a settler. Very rarely were there maids in the backwoods of Canada. While developing the country we now know today, the average noble woman had to learn the basics that they'd never done for themselves before. Baking bread that rises, mending and making your own clothes, soap, etc. Partrail states, "Remember that all practical knowledge is highly valuable in the land of which they are going. Cooking, curing meat, making the butter and cheese, knitting, dressmaking, and tailoring, for most of the country people here make the everyday clothing for their husbands, brothers, or sons, are good to be learned." Ultimately, the 1830s were a rude awakening for British settlers in Canada, at least for those coming from money and a comfortable life. While fashion and life in Britain was being romanticized with bold colors and all new shapes and undergarments, life for new Canadians was much more stark, cold, and based on survival in a new environment. My name's Hannah Bone, and I will see you next week for another episode of Fashion Friday.